At 19, Lena Mercer had $43 in her checking account, a stack of bills her mother could barely help her pay, and a community college acceptance letter she had already decided she could not afford to use when an attorney called with news that made absolutely no sense. Evelyn Ward, the 86-year-old woman who had lived 3 doors away, had left Lena her corner house. Lena had known Evelyn since she was 11, but there had never been anything extraordinary about their relationship. Every Saturday, Lena walked to the market with Evelyn's grocery list, brought the bags back, changed the occasional light bulb, moved a heavy box when Evelyn asked, and sometimes stayed for tea. She was never Evelyn's caregiver. She was never promised money. She was simply the neighborhood girl who kept showing up. So when Evelyn died, Lena expected nothing except an empty chair behind a familiar window. Instead, she found herself sitting across from an estate attorney while Evelyn's stunned niece watched him explain that Lena could take ownership of the house by paying a symbolic price of exactly $1. Her mother thought accepting it was dangerous. Evelyn's relatives could not understand why a 19-year-old neighbor deserved a house they believed should have stayed in the family. Even Lena felt embarrassed by it. 8 years of carrying groceries did not equal a house, and she knew it. Worse, the place needed repairs she could not afford, taxes she had never paid before, insurance she barely understood, and enough maintenance to turn a free inheritance into a financial disaster. Selling seemed obvious. Take the money, help her mother, finally go to college, and stop pretending sentiment could pay bills. But Evelyn had anticipated that decision. Before Lena could sell the property, the attorney handed her one final instruction from the dead woman: inventory everything in the small room behind the upstairs linen closet. Lena froze because she had been inside Evelyn's house hundreds of times and had never known there was a room behind that closet. When she finally moved the shelves and opened the narrow door, she expected forgotten furniture or boxes of old family possessions. Instead, she found filing cabinets packed tightly against the walls, shelves filled with notebooks, hundreds of envelopes, decades of receipts, letters, photographs, rent statements, utility bills, school expenses, bus tickets, and handwritten notes. Nothing was organized by year. Nothing was organized by money. Every file was organized by a person's name. Some belonged to people Lena recognized from Maple Crossing. Some belonged to people who had died before she was born. And besides certain names, Evelyn had written the same strange words, repaid not in money. That was when Lena realized the lonely old woman everyone thought she had been helping for 8 years had been keeping a hidden record for more than half a century. A record of ordinary people, desperate moments, small amounts of money, and favors that seemed to pass from one person to another across generations. But the discovery that truly stopped Lena came when she reached the back of one drawer and found several files connected by Evelyn's handwritten arrows. Every arrow eventually pointed toward the same surname, Mercer, her own family name. And buried among those papers was a sealed file belonging to Lena's father, David Mercer, who had died when she was 9. Lena had believed she was the one who started helping Evelyn when she picked up an old woman's grocery bags at 11 years old. She was about to discover that the story had actually begun years before Lena was born, and that Evelyn had a very specific reason for giving a broke 19-year-old neighbor an entire house for $1. But before we open David Mercer's file and discover what Evelyn had been recording all those years, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're listening early in the morning, during a quiet afternoon, or late at night, wherever you are, I hope you're having a peaceful day. And I wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening ahead. And if you enjoy emotional inheritance stories about ordinary people, forgotten kindness,
hidden family connections, and discoveries that completely change the meaning of what someone left behind. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Now, let's go back to 19-year-old Lena Mercer. Because before she could understand why her dead father's name was hidden inside Evelyn Ward's house, she first had to understand why a woman with surviving relatives had chosen to leave that house to the neighborhood girl who carried her groceries. Lena Mercer counted her tips twice before accepting that the total was not going to improve. $26 in cash lay beside a half-empty glass of water on the diner counter, and another $17 remained in her checking account. $43. That was everything she had until her next shift. Her phone bill was due Friday. Her mother had mentioned the rent that morning without actually asking Lena for help, which was Rachel Mercer's usual way of asking for help. Lena folded the bills into her wallet and tried not to think about the community college acceptance letter still sitting unopened for the third time on her bedroom desk. She had been accepted. That was the easy part. Paying for it was something else. At 19, Lena had imagined she would feel more like an adult. Instead, adulthood seemed to consist mostly of deciding which problem could wait longest. Evelyn Ward's funeral had been 4 days earlier. Lena had attended with Rachel and stood near the back because she had never considered herself family. Evelyn had been the elderly woman 3 doors down, the woman with the faded corner house and the grocery list written every Saturday in neat blue ink. Their routine had begun when Lena was 11. She had seen Evelyn struggling with 2 grocery bags on the sidewalk and carried them home for her. The following Saturday, Evelyn asked whether Lena happened to be going toward the market. Eventually, there was no need to ask. Evelyn made a list. Lena walked to the store, paid with money Evelyn provided, returned with the receipt and exact change, and carried everything into the kitchen. Over 8 years, the errands expanded slightly. Lena changed light bulbs Evelyn could no longer safely reach, moved boxes, opened stubborn jars, and occasionally stayed for tea. Evelyn never treated her like hired help, and Lena never thought of herself as a caregiver. It was simply something she did on Saturdays. Now there would be no more lists. Lena was wiping the diner counter when her phone vibrated. The caller introduced himself as Thomas Reed, attorney for Evelyn Ward's estate, and asked whether Lena could come to his office the following afternoon. Why? Lena asked. Mrs. Ward included you in her estate instructions. Lena nearly laughed. Me? Yes. Are you sure you have the right Lena Mercer? Thomas paused. 19 years old? Maple Crossing. Yes. Then I have the right person. Rachel was immediately suspicious when Lena told her, maybe she left you a little money. For groceries, you helped her for 8 years. She paid me back every week for the groceries. Lena shook her head. I didn't do anything worth putting in a will. Thomas Reed's office occupied the second floor of an older brick building near downtown. When Lena and Rachel arrived the next afternoon, another woman was already waiting. Lena recognized Margaret Hale, Evelyn's niece from the funeral. Margaret looked tired rather than friendly. Thomas invited them into a conference room and explained the basic estate arrangements without ceremony. Then he turned toward Lena. Mrs. Ward owned her residence at the corner of Linden and Ash outright. Lena knew the house better than she knew most buildings in Maple Crossing. 2 stories, narrow porch, faded cream siding, small backyard, old maple near the sidewalk. Okay, she said. Thomas folded his hands. She directed that the property be transferred to you. Lena stared at him. Rachel stopped moving beside her. Margaret spoke first. I'm sorry. Thomas repeated himself. Lena felt heat rise into her face. That can't be right. It is. She left me the house, yes. Margaret looked directly at Lena now. The disbelief on her face matched Lena's own. Why, Lena asked. Mrs. Ward's will is valid, and her instructions concerning the property are clear. That isn't what I asked. I understand. I can tell you what she directed. I cannot tell you everything she was thinking when she directed it. Rachel leaned forward. What does Lena have to pay? That question sounded much more like her mother. Thomas explained that Evelyn's arrangement required a symbolic consideration to complete the transfer. $1. Lena blinked. $1? Yes. Margaret gave a short, disbelieving breath. Lena wished the floor would open beneath her. 8 years of grocery bags suddenly looked different under another person's stare, as if every Saturday could now be mistaken for an investment Lena had secretly expected to mature. I never asked her for this, she said. Margaret's expression tightened. I didn't say you did. But the question remained between them. Rachel touched Lena's wrist. You don't have to decide this second. Thomas nodded. You are entitled to obtain independent advice before accepting. Lena looked at her mother. They were renting a house they struggled to afford, and Lena had $43 to her name. Sitting in front of her was an attorney telling her she could own a house for less than the price of a diner coffee. It should have felt miraculous. Instead, it felt impossible. If I accept, it's really mine? She asked, along with the responsibilities of ownership, taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs. Rachel's face changed immediately. A free house could still cost money. Lena thought about Evelyn's aging roof, the pipes that sometimes knocked in winter, and the porch step she had learned to avoid because it shifted under weight. Still, a house was a house. Thomas opened a folder and slid a document toward her. After several minutes of questions, Lena reached into her wallet. She removed one of her crumpled dollar bills and placed it on the polished conference table. Thomas looked at it, then at her. Mrs. Ward was very specific about that. Apparently, she was specific about everything. There is one more instruction. Lena's hand stopped above the document. Thomas removed a sealed envelope bearing her name in Evelyn's familiar blue handwriting. Mrs. Ward anticipated that you might consider selling the property, particularly because of your age and the costs involved. Rachel murmured. At least she understood that. She did not prohibit a sale, Thomas continued, but she asked that you complete one task before making that decision. Lena opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet. Evelyn's instruction was brief. Before selling the house, Lena was to make a complete inventory of everything stored in the small room behind the upstairs linen closet. Lena read the sentence again. What room? Thomas said nothing. There isn't a room behind the linen closet. She knew that hallway. She had fetched towels from that closet, replaced a bulb above it, and carried boxes past it dozens of times. Margaret frowned. What is she talking about? Lena looked at Rachel, but her mother was equally confused. Then she looked back at Evelyn's handwritten instruction. In 8 years of Saturdays and hundreds of visits to the corner house, Lena had never known there was a room behind that closet. Lena waited until Saturday morning to enter Evelyn's house again. She could have gone sooner, but the key Thomas Reed had given her felt heavier than a key should. And for 2 days, she left it untouched on her bedroom dresser, beside Evelyn's instruction. Rachel finally ended the delay by putting on her coat and saying, If that house has been sitting empty, we should at least make sure nothing is leaking. It was exactly the kind of concern Lena could understand. They walked the 3 doors from their rental to the corner of Linden and Ash. Lena unlocked the front door and instinctively called, Evelyn. The name escaped before she could stop it. Silence answered. Rachel touched her shoulder once but said nothing. Without Evelyn in it, the house seemed older. The living room smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish. A clock had stopped on the mantel. Evelyn's chair remained beside the window, and Lena had to look away from it. Before we go upstairs, Rachel said, You need to understand what you accepted. She pointed toward a brown stain near one ceiling corner. That could be roof trouble. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped after Lena tightened it. One cabinet door sagged. The basement stairs creaked badly enough that Rachel refused to let Lena descend until someone checked them. The electrical panel looked old. Several windows were drafty around their frames. Taxes, Rachel said as they returned upstairs. Insurance, heat, plumbing, roof, anything hidden in those walls. I know. No, you know the words. That's different from paying for them. Lena bristled. Should I have refused it? I didn't say that. You keep listing reasons I can't afford it, because you can't, Rachel softened when she saw Lena's face. Honey, a house for $1 can still bankrupt somebody. Lena looked down the hallway. 24 hours earlier, owning any house had seemed like impossible good fortune. Now she could almost hear money draining from places she had not known required money. Then maybe I sell it. Rachel did not answer immediately. Maybe, but Evelyn asked you to do something first. The upstairs linen closet stood at the end of the hall exactly where Lena remembered it. White painted doors, brass knob, towels stacked on shelves, extra blankets on top. Nothing about it suggested another room existed behind it. Lena removed the towels while Rachel carried them into Evelyn's bedroom. The shelves appeared fixed, but when Lena examined the side supports, she found screws hidden beneath small wooden caps. She really covered this, Lena said, or whoever built it did. They found a screwdriver downstairs. Removing the shelving took nearly 40 minutes because 2 screws had rusted and one refused to turn until Rachel held the bracket while Lena worked it loose. Behind the final shelf was painted paneling with a narrow vertical seam. Lena ran her fingers along it and found a recessed metal latch near the floor. There! Rachel leaned closer. That's a door. Lena pulled. Nothing happened. She tried again harder. The panel shifted with a dry crack of old paint and opened inward several inches. Dust drifted into the closet. Beyond it was darkness. Rachel immediately said, "Don't go walking in there until we know the floor is safe." Lena used her phone flashlight first. The hidden space was not dramatic. No stone walls, no tunnel, no antique safe. It was a narrow room, tucked beneath the slope of the roof, perhaps 8 feet wide and twice as long, with an old pull-chain light hanging overhead. Lena reached through the doorway and tugged it. A yellow bulb came on. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Wooden shelves covered another. Cardboard document boxes were stacked neatly beneath them. There were notebooks, envelopes, binders, and bundles of papers tied with string. "This is what she wanted inventoried?" Rachel asked. Apparently. Lena stepped carefully inside. The floor held firm. The room smelled of paper and dry wood. Everything had been preserved with the kind of order Evelyn brought to grocery lists. Lena opened the nearest box, expecting household bills. Instead, she found folders arranged alphabetically. Each tab carried a person's name. Anders, Paul, Belle, Arthur, Carson, Mary, Dawson, Ruth. She opened another box. More names. Some were familiar Maple Crossing surnames. Others meant nothing to her. Maybe these were people she worked with. Lena said. Rachel pulled a notebook from a shelf. Its index contained names followed by dates spanning decades. That's a lot of coworkers. One filing cabinet had 4 drawers. Lena opened the top one. Individual folders filled it from front to back. Why would anyone keep this much paperwork about other people? Rachel asked. Lena chose a folder at random. Inside were 2 receipts, a handwritten note, and an envelope. Nothing explained the collection. She returned it carefully. Evelyn had asked for an inventory, not permission to scatter everything across the floor. Lena found a legal pad and began listing what they could see: 6 document boxes, 4 metal filing cabinets, 11 notebooks, 3 binders, envelopes arranged by surname, several photograph packets. The deeper she looked, the stranger the organization became. There were no obvious categories for taxes, property records, or Evelyn's personal banking. Nearly everything centered on names. Rachel stood at the second cabinet, reading labels. Suddenly, she stopped. Wait. What? I know this name. She pulled out a folder marked Marjorie Keene. Mrs. Keene lived on Birch Street when you were little. She moved away years ago. Was she Evelyn's friend? Not that I remember. Rachel opened the folder. The first document was an old electric bill dated January 1989. A red notice showed an overdue balance. Attached behind it was a payment receipt. Lena frowned. Why would Evelyn have Mrs. Keene's electric bill? Rachel turned over a small card clipped to the receipt. Evelyn's handwriting appeared in blue ink. There were only 4 words beneath the date. Heat restored Thursday. Lena looked again at the overdue notice, then the payment receipt. This was not a keepsake. It was proof that someone's electricity had been shut off and then restored. Did Evelyn pay this? Lena asked. Rachel shook her head slowly. I don't know. Lena looked around the cramped room at the cabinets and boxes containing hundreds of other names. Until that moment, she had imagined Evelyn's hidden room might contain family papers, old photographs, or documents connected to the house. Instead, the first recognizable file belonged to a woman who had lived elsewhere in Maple Crossing, and Evelyn had preserved her unpaid electric bill for nearly 4 decades. Lena held the card under the yellow light and read the 4 words again. Heat restored Thursday. Then she looked at the hundreds of files surrounding them and wondered why Evelyn Ward had spent so much of her life keeping records of other people's problems. Lena returned to Evelyn's house the next afternoon with a notebook, a box of pencils, and a rule for herself. Inventory first, conclusions later. Rachel was working, so Lena sat alone in the hidden room with the door propped open and began recording each cabinet, box, and notebook exactly where she found it. The work should have been boring. Instead, every folder made the room harder to explain. Marjorie Keene's electric bill was not unusual. Lena found a rent receipt from 1994 in another file, followed by a handwritten note stating that 2 weeks had been covered while the tenant recovered from surgery. Another folder contained receipts for children's shoes and winter coats. A third held a bus ticket, an application form, and a short note from Evelyn. Interview Monday. Fare both ways. Lena stopped inventorying long enough to calculate what she was seeing. These were not Evelyn's expenses in any normal household sense. They were other people's emergencies. She opened the file of a woman named Teresa Cole. Inside was a pharmacy receipt and a note showing Evelyn had paid part of the cost. Another folder contained a school examination fee. Another held 3 grocery receipts from consecutive weeks, each with the recipient's name written across the top. Some amounts were only a few dollars. Others would have been substantial when the payments were made. Lena began adding a second column to her inventory apparent purpose. Rent, food, utilities, transportation, medicine, school, work. By late afternoon, a pattern covered several pages. "What were you doing, Evelyn?" she whispered. The obvious answer made Lena uncomfortable. Evelyn had been helping people. But that created another question. Why keep evidence of it? Lena remembered how carefully Evelyn counted grocery change. She had never been careless about money. Maybe these were loans. Maybe the files existed because Evelyn expected repayment. That explanation made more sense until Lena opened Paul Anders's folder. The first page recorded money Evelyn had provided toward a car repair decades earlier. Behind it was a note from Paul thanking her and promising to repay every dollar. Lena expected a receipt showing he had. Instead, Evelyn had written across the page in blue ink, "Repaid, not in money." Beneath it was another note. Paul repaired Mrs. Donnelly's furnace during January freeze. Charged parts only. Lena read it twice. She searched the next folders more carefully. Mary Carson had received help with rent after losing work. Her file also carried the same words, "Repaid, not in money," underneath. Evelyn had written that Mary later kept another woman's children for several weeks while their mother worked nights. Ruth Dawson's file contained a utility payment, followed years later by a note that Ruth had provided a spare room to a family displaced after an apartment fire. Lena sat back. Evelyn had not been tracking repayment to herself. She had been tracking what people did afterward. The discovery changed the room. The cabinets no longer looked like records of dents. They looked like lines connecting one problem to another. Some files ended without any later note. Some contained only one receipt. Evelyn had not forced every story into the same pattern, but enough of them carried the phrase that Lena could see what she had been watching. Help moved. Not always, not neatly, but sometimes the person receiving it became the person giving it. Lena recognized one name from the cabinet, Arthur Bell. She knew him as the retired mail carrier who still walked Maple Crossing most mornings, despite being in his 70s. His file contained an old payment connected to work clothes and several later notes. Rather than open more without context, Lena carried the name home with her. The following morning she found Arthur trimming a hedge outside his small brick house. "Mr. Bell," he turned. "Lena Mercer. I heard about Evelyn. And the house." Lena hesitated. "Can I ask you something about her?" Arthur rested the clippers against his leg. "You can ask." "Did Evelyn help people with money?" His expression changed just enough to answer before he spoke. "Sometimes. For how long?" "Longer than you've been alive." "Why didn't anybody talk about it?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Because Evelyn would have hated that." Lena explained only enough about the hidden records to ask whether what she had found was real. Arthur listened carefully. "She bought me a decent pair of work boots when I was young," he said. "I gotten a temporary delivery job and showed up the first morning in shoes with a split sole. She found out somehow." "Did you pay her back?" "Tried. She wouldn't take it." Arthur shook his head. "She told me I'd probably find somebody who needed the money worse than she did." Lena thought of his file. "Did you?" Arthur looked toward the street. "Eventually." He did not offer details, and Lena did not press. His confirmation was enough. Evelyn had not invented those records afterward. She had been quietly maintaining them while the people around her went on with their lives. "Was she wealthy?" Lena asked. Arthur laughed. "Evelyn? No." "Then how could she keep doing this?" "She didn't solve everybody's problems. That's not what she did." He picked up the hedge clippers again. "She handled small things when she could." Back in the hidden room, Lena understood the files differently. Evelyn had not paid mortgages or rescued entire families. She had covered the bus fare that got someone to an interview, bought groceries for a week, paid enough of an overdue bill to restore heat, found school shoes, written job references, given people temporary room to breathe. Lena worked through another cabinet until she found a notebook that seemed to function as an index. Names filled the pages, followed by dates, amounts, and arrows pointing toward other names. Some chains stopped after one person. Others crossed years. One entry led to another file, then another, as though Evelyn had been following the movement of a favor long after the original expense was forgotten. Lena began copying the connections into her notebook. An hour later, she noticed several arrows converging near the back of one section. She followed them across 3 pages.
The handwriting became smaller where Evelyn had added later entries.
One arrow came from a family Lena vaguely remembered. Another came from a man whose name Rachel had mentioned years ago. A third began with an expense recorded before Lena was born. All three pointed toward the same surname. Lena stared at it. Until that moment, the hidden room had belonged to Evelyn's history and the private struggles of people Lena mostly did not know. Now her own family name sat in the middle of the record. Written in Evelyn Ward's blue ink was one word Lena could not explain. Mercer. Lena stared at the surname until the letters seemed detached from meaning. Mercer. She checked the page before it, then the page after, hoping the arrows might lead somewhere else. They did not. 3 separate lines ended beside her family name. She searched the cabinet for a folder labeled Mercer and found several references, but not the complete file she expected. One thin folder concerned a distant relative Rachel had once mentioned. Another contained a receipt attached to the name of someone Lena remembered only from childhood conversations. None explained why Evelyn had drawn those arrows. Lena copied every reference into her notebook before putting the papers back exactly where she found them. By the time Rachel came home from work that evening, Lena was waiting at the kitchen table. "Did Evelyn know our family before me?" Rachel stopped with one hand still on her purse. "Of course she knew us. We lived 3 doors away. Before we lived here?" Rachel removed her coat slowly. "Why?" Lena opened her notebook and turned it around. "Our name is in Evelyn's records." Rachel looked down. Lena watched recognition arrive before her mother hid it. "What records?" "The ones in that room. Evelyn helped people, rent, utilities, groceries, transportation. She kept records of it. And some of them connect to Mercer's." Rachel sat across from her. "Which Mercer's? That's what I'm asking you." Lena pointed to one name. "Do you remember this person?" Rachel nodded reluctantly. "Your father's cousin. We weren't close. Evelyn helped him, I don't know. There's a receipt in his file." Rachel rubbed her forehead. She had just finished a long nursing home shift, and Lena immediately felt guilty for confronting her before she had even eaten. She closed the notebook. "Sorry, we can talk later?" "No." Rachel's voice softened. "You're allowed to ask. I just don't know what Evelyn wrote down." That answer caught Lena's attention. "You knew she kept records?" "No." "But you knew she helped people." Rachel looked toward the dark kitchen window. "Everybody knew Evelyn helped people sometimes. Arthur Bell knew. Arthur has lived here forever. He said she'd been doing it longer than I've been alive." Rachel stood and opened the refrigerator. "That sounds like Evelyn." Lena waited. "Did Dad know her?" Rachel's hand stopped on the refrigerator door. Only for a second, but Lena saw it. "Mom." "Yes," Rachel said. "Your father knew Evelyn." "How well?" "Better than you realized." Rachel took out a container of leftovers and set it on the counter. "Can we leave it there tonight?" "Why?" "Because I'm tired." "Lena." "That isn't why." Rachel turned toward her. "Not every hesitation means somebody is hiding something terrible." Lena flinched at the sharpness. Rachel immediately looked sorry, but neither apologized. The next morning, Lena returned to the corner house. She searched methodically rather than tearing through the cabinets. Evelyn's careful organization deserved better than that, and Lena was increasingly aware that the files contained private moments from real lives. She found Mercer references scattered through several decades, but still no complete explanation. One note linked Evelyn to a small grocery payment for a family member. Another recorded a ride arranged for someone during an illness. These were pieces, not answers. Lena was replacing a folder when someone knocked downstairs. Margaret Hale stood on the porch. "I was hoping you'd be here," she said. Lena stepped aside. Margaret entered but remained near the door. looking around the living room as though the furniture itself had become disputed territory. Thomas told me the transfer is proceeding. Yes. And you paid the $1. Lena could hear the absurdity of it when Margaret said it aloud. Yes. Margaret's eyes moved toward Evelyn's chair. I spoke with Thomas again. I asked about my aunt's state of mind when she made the decision. Lena's stomach tightened. What did he say? That he had no concerns about her capacity. Margaret gave a tired laugh without humor. He was very professional about it. I didn't ask Evelyn for the house. I know you keep saying that, because it's true. Margaret looked at her. Do you understand what this looks like to her family? Lena wanted to defend herself, but the answer was yes. A 19-year-old neighbor had spent years visiting an elderly woman and then inherited her most valuable property. From the outside, suspicion was easy. I understand why you're upset. That seemed to surprise Margaret. Do you? If my aunt gave her house to someone I barely knew, I'd probably ask questions too. Margaret's expression loosened slightly, then hardened again. I visited Evelyn less than I should have. That doesn't mean I stopped being her niece. I didn't say it did. But you were here every week. I brought groceries. For 8 years, she gave me the money. I brought back the receipt and change. You changed things around the house. You spent time with her. Sometimes, Margaret stepped farther into the room. Then tell me something I can understand. What did you do for my aunt that was worth a house? The question hurt because Lena had been asking herself exactly the same thing. She thought of rainy Saturdays, heavy grocery bags, tea she sometimes drank only because Evelyn wanted company. None of it came close. Nothing. Lena said. Margaret frowned. What? Nothing worth a house? I carried groceries, I changed light bulbs, I moved boxes. Sometimes I stayed and talked. That's it. Margaret studied her as if waiting for another answer. Lena had none. Then why you I don't know. Margaret looked toward the staircase. Thomas mentioned an inventory. Lena did not elaborate. Evelyn's records contained other people's private hardships, and Lena did not yet feel entitled to describe them. I'm following her instructions. Margaret nodded slowly. I hope you find whatever explanation she thought was enough. After she left, Lena stood alone in the living room, ashamed of an inheritance she had not requested. For the first time, selling the house seemed appealing for a reason unrelated to money. A sale could end the questions. But even if Lena sold it tomorrow, Margaret's question would remain. What had Lena done that was worth a house? That evening she tried Rachel again. This time she did not bring the notebook. Margaret came by. Rachel looked concerned. Was she rude? Not exactly. She asked why Evelyn chose me, and I couldn't answer. Rachel sat beside her on the couch. Lena looked at her mother. I need to know why Dad's connected to this. Rachel's shoulders lowered. You're not going to let it go? Would you? A long silence followed. Lena remembered her father mostly in fragments, his laugh, his work jacket, the way he cut sandwiches diagonally because Lena insisted they tasted better that way. She had been 9 when he died. Adults had decided which memories and explanations a child could handle, and some doors had apparently remained closed after she grew old enough to open them. Did Evelyn help him? Lena asked. Rachel's eyes filled with something Lena could not identify as sadness or reluctance. Your father knew Evelyn years before you started taking groceries to her. How Rachel clasped her hands. He was young, younger than I was when I had you. Things weren't going well for him for a while. What things? That part is his story, and I don't know what Evelyn kept in those files. I'd rather you see what he wrote. If she kept it, then hear an incomplete version from me. Lena leaned forward. So there is something. Rachel nodded. Yes. Did he owe her money? No. Then what? Rachel looked directly at her. Your father owed Evelyn something. Lena waited. Rachel's next words were quiet. It wasn't money. By Monday morning, Lena had learned that owning a house made people ask questions she had never needed answers to before. What were the annual property taxes? How much would insurance cost? How old was the roof? Had the plumbing ever been replaced? Was the electrical system safe? She had answers to none of them. Rachel had written a list on the back of an envelope and circled one sentence twice. Do not spend money until you know what needs fixing. Lena understood the warning, but the house refused to wait politely while she figured out adulthood. The kitchen faucet still dripped. One upstairs window would not close completely. A damp stain near the living room ceiling looked larger whenever Lena stared at it. She called Noah Bennett that afternoon. Noah was 21 and had grown up close enough to Maple Crossing that Lena had known him for years. He worked residential repair jobs with his uncle and arrived after work wearing dusty boots and carrying a flashlight. I'm not an inspector, he warned before stepping inside. I know anything serious. You need somebody licensed. I know, Noah smiled. You always say that right before proving you don't know. Under different circumstances, she might have laughed. Instead, she handed him Rachel's list. Noah checked only what he could reasonably see. The shifting porch step needed attention. The roof showed age and possible trouble near the section above the living room stain. The kitchen faucet was probably a minor repair, but old plumbing could hide larger problems. He looked at the electrical panel without touching anything and told Lena to have an electrician evaluated. How bad? She asked. I can't tell you that. Guess? No. Noah, you inherited a house. Not my ability to magically see through walls. He softened. Some of this could be manageable. Some might not be. Get actual estimates before you panic. I'm already panicking for free. They stood in Evelyn's kitchen while the faucet produced another slow drop. Lena told him about taxes and insurance. She did not tell him details from the hidden files. I had $43 when I inherited this place, she said. Technically, $42 after the house. Noah laughed, then realized she was serious. You really paid $1? One whole dollar? Worst negotiation of your life. This time she did laugh, briefly. Then she looked around the kitchen Evelyn had occupied for decades. What if I can't afford to keep it? Then you make a decision based on numbers, not guilt. That sounds suspiciously reasonable. My uncle says that every time somebody falls in love with a bad renovation. I'm not in love with the house. Lena thought of Evelyn's empty chair. That might be the problem. 2 days later, she had enough preliminary information to understand Rachel's fear. Even without catastrophic repairs, ownership would require money every month. If the roof needed substantial work, the cost could be far beyond anything Lena could cover from diner shifts. An electrician would cost money just to evaluate what she might need to spend more money fixing. Rachel studied the numbers at their kitchen table. You need to consider selling. Lena nodded. I know. That doesn't mean you're ungrateful. Margaret might disagree. Margaret isn't paying the bills. Lena looked at the community college letter on the counter. Selling the house could change everything. She could enroll instead of postponing again. Rachel could stop carrying every emergency alone. They might even have savings. A concept that currently felt fictional. The possibility became less theoretical when a local property buyer contacted Thomas and expressed straightforward interest in the corner house. There was no dramatic pressure, only an offer to discuss a sale in its present condition. That almost made it harder to dismiss. Lena wrote the number Thomas relayed on her notebook and stared at it for a long time. It was more money than she had ever imagined controlling. You don't have to answer now, Rachel said. I know. Finish Evelyn's inventory. Lena nodded. Then decide. The next morning she returned to the hidden room. Money followed her upstairs in the form of every estimate she had heard and every bill she knew was coming. She opened Evelyn's files, looking less like a curious neighbor and more like a 19-year-old trying to determine whether preserving old paper justified keeping an expensive building. Yet the records resisted becoming meaningless. One file documented groceries bought for a family during 3 weeks of unemployment. Another showed a small school payment. Another contained a letter of recommendation Evelyn had written for a young woman seeking clerical work. Lena noticed something she had missed before. Evelyn almost never placed herself at the end of a chain. Whenever there was a later entry, the record moved outward. Someone helped with rent, later drove an elderly neighbor to medical appointments. Someone given bus fare later paid another person's application fee. The amounts mattered less than what followed them. In one notebook, Lena found a sentence boxed in blue ink. Help that stops with the receiver becomes charity. Help that moves becomes community. Lena read it several times. Evelyn had never spoken like that during their Saturday teas. Or perhaps Lena had simply been too young, too distracted, or too accustomed to the old woman to ask the right questions. She turned the page. Several names were connected by arrows. Some she had already seen. Beside one was the familiar phrase, repaid not in money. Lena traced the line to the next name and suddenly understood why Evelyn's records had occupied an entire room. She was not recording who owed her. She was recording whether something continued. The realization should have made the inheritance clearer. Instead, it made Lena more uncomfortable. She could sell the house and preserve the papers. Evelyn had not forbidden that. But before making that decision, Lena needed to understand why her own family appeared inside the same chain. She returned to the Mercer references. Rachel's words had followed her for days. Your father owed Evelyn something. It wasn't money. Lena searched one cabinet carefully, then another. She found nothing under David's first name. She checked the notebooks again, following dates and arrows. Near the bottom of a document box sat several envelopes beneath a stack of older folders. Lena lifted them out one at a time. The last envelope was thicker than the others, yellowed slightly at the edges, and sealed with an old paper fastener. Evelyn's handwriting ran across the front. Lena stopped breathing for a moment. She had not seen her father's full name written by someone else in years. Her fingers tightened around the envelope. David Mercer. Lena sat on the floor of the hidden room, with the envelope resting across both hands. For several seconds, she did not open it. Her father's name made the cramped room feel smaller, as if the years between his death and this moment had collapsed without warning. David Mercer had been gone for 10 years. Lena still remembered his laugh more clearly than his voice, the worn brown work jacket he wore in cold weather, the way he cut her sandwiches diagonally because she had once declared square sandwiches unacceptable. She remembered him as her father. She had never imagined Evelyn Ward had known a version of him that existed before Lena was born. Finally, she loosened the old paper fastener. The first document was a rent notice dated more than 20 years earlier. David had been 22. Lena read the amount twice. It was not enormous, but the handwritten notes around it made the situation clear. David had lost his job, missed part of 1 month's rent, and was close to falling further behind. A second paper showed a payment made on his behalf. Evelyn's handwriting appeared beside it. Enough for 3 weeks. He starts looking again Monday. Lena swallowed. Beneath that was a copy of a handwritten letter from David. The paper had yellowed at the folds. His handwriting was slanted and impatient. Nothing like Evelyn's precise blue script. Mrs. Ward, I will repay every dollar as soon as I'm working again. I mean it. Lena traced the edge of the page with one finger. She had seen her father's handwriting on old birthday cards, but this felt different. This was David before marriage, before fatherhood, before Lena existed. A young man frightened enough about money to promise repayment in writing. Another note documented that Evelyn had spoken to someone about an opening at a local maintenance company. She had not guaranteed David work. She had arranged an interview. Attached behind it was a bus schedule with one departure circled. Lena kept reading. David got the job. 2 weeks later, another letter appeared. First paycheck came through. I can bring you 20 Friday and the rest next month. Across it, Evelyn had written one sentence. Declined. The next letter offered again, then another. David became more insistent each time. You helped me when nobody had to. Please let me pay you back. Evelyn's response had been preserved in a small sheet torn from a notepad. No. When you can carry something for somebody else, carry it. Lena stopped. The words seemed simple enough to belong anywhere, yet she could hear Evelyn saying them in the same practical tone she once used to tell Lena where to place canned soup or how much change should come back from the market. There was no speech about generosity, no demand for gratitude, just an instruction to move the help forward. Lena continued through the file. David eventually stopped offering Evelyn money. Instead, the records became less direct. A note several years later said, David fixed Coleman's back steps after injury, refused payment. Another said, brought groceries to Mrs. Perez during winter illness. Lena knew neither name, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her father had entered the same chain she had been reading in other files. She felt suddenly angry that no one had told her, then guilty for being angry. David had died when she was 9. Perhaps there had never been a right time to explain a small debt from his 20s. Perhaps Rachel had been carrying too many larger memories. Lena gathered the papers carefully and went home before she could invent explanations on her own. Rachel was in the kitchen folding laundry when Lena entered with the file held against her chest. Her mother saw the name on the front and stopped. You found it? Lena nodded. You knew it existed, not the file. I knew what happened. Lena sat at the table. He lost his job. Rachel took the chair across from her. Yes. He was behind on rent. Yes. Evelyn paid it, part of it. Enough to stop things getting worse. And she got him an interview. She knew someone who knew someone. That was how Evelyn did things. Lena placed the note between them. She wouldn't let him repay her. Rachel looked at the familiar handwriting and smiled sadly. That drove him crazy. Why didn't you ever tell me? Rachel folded her hands. Because when you were little, it was just one of many stories about your father. Then he died, and every story started feeling important. I kept thinking I'd tell you when you were older. I'm 19, I noticed. Lena almost smiled, but the feeling passed. Did he really help other people because of this? Rachel leaned back. Not because he thought he owed Evelyn forever. That's important. She looked toward the hallway, gathering the memory. A few years before he died, one of the men he worked with had a bad winter. Hours cut, child sick, everything at once. Your father started dropping groceries at their place. Never made a big thing of it. When the man tried to pay him later, David told him to help somebody else when he could. Lena looked down at Evelyn's note. Exactly what she told him, almost word for word. Did Dad tell you why eventually? Rachel gave a quiet laugh. He said Evelyn had made repayment impossible, so the only way to stop feeling like he owed her was to do what she asked. Lena imagined her father carrying grocery bags into someone else's kitchen. Years before 11-year-old Lena ever picked up Evelyn's bags on the sidewalk. The resemblance unsettled her. Not because it felt supernatural, because it was ordinary. A sentence had moved from Evelyn to David, then into choices he made. And somehow Lena had grown up close to those choices without knowing their origin. "So when you said he owed Evelyn something," Lena began. Rachel nodded. "He thought he owed her the obligation to notice when somebody needed help. And you knew she knew me because of him. I knew she remembered him. I didn't know she was watching you in any special way." Lena looked sharply at her. "Watching me? That's not what I meant," Rachel corrected herself. "I mean, she knew whose daughter you were. That's all I know." Lena returned to the hidden room before sunset. The file felt different now that Rachel had confirmed the story. She placed each document back in order, unwilling to disturb anything. Near the rear of the envelope, behind David's last repayment letter, she found several smaller notes she had missed earlier. Most recorded ordinary things, dates, names, brief references to people David later helped. Then she found one written in Evelyn's blue ink after the date of David's death. Lena knew that immediately because she had memorized that year in childhood as the dividing line between before and after. The note contained only 6 words. Lena read them once, then again. "Watch the girl. Do not tell her." Lena read Evelyn's note until the words began to feel almost accusatory. Watch the girl. Do not tell her. She hated it immediately. The phrase made 8 years of ordinary Saturdays feel staged, as though every grocery bag, every cup of tea, every forgotten errand had happened under observation she never agreed to. By the time she reached home, anger had overtaken confusion. Rachel was sorting mail at the kitchen counter when Lena walked in. "Did Evelyn ever test me?" Rachel looked up. "What?" Lena placed the note in front of her. "She wrote this after Dad died." Rachel read it slowly. "Watch the girl. Do not tell her." That sounds like a test. Or it sounds like Evelyn. That is not an answer. Lena paced toward the sink. What if she knew exactly what she was doing? What if every time I brought groceries over, she was keeping score? Rachel turned toward her Lena. "You were 11 when you started helping her." "Exactly. You think an 80-something-year-old woman designed an 8-year experiment around a child carrying grocery bags?" Lena stopped. Hearing it aloud made the idea sound less convincing. But the note still bothered her. Then what was she watching? Rachel slid the paper back. "Maybe you should look at the records before deciding." Lena did not want to admit her mother was right. The next morning, she returned to the hidden room and searched for entries written after David's death. Evelyn's system was consistent enough that Lena eventually found a thin notebook with dates beginning around that time. At first, there was nothing about her. Evelyn recorded several names Lena had seen elsewhere, along with brief updates. Then, months after the note in David's file, Lena's own name appeared for the first time. The entry was short. Lena Mercer, age 11. Carried groceries from market without being asked. Would not take $2. Lena stared at the sentence. She remembered the day, though not perfectly. Evelyn had been standing near the corner with 2 bags, one tearing at the bottom. Lena had taken the heavier one. Evelyn had offered her money afterward. Lena had refused because it had taken less than 5 minutes and because at 11, $2 had somehow felt too much for carrying a bag 3 blocks. There had been no arrangement, no invitation, no promise of another errand. The next entry came a week later, came again, asked if I needed anything from market. Lena exhaled slowly. She turned the page. The early notes were sparse. Sometimes months passed between mentions. Evelyn had not documented every Saturday. Evenly had not documented afterwards. She had noted only moments that seemed to matter to her. Forgot list. Returned 15 minutes later, embarrassed. Lena smiled despite herself. She remembered that one. She had left Evelyn's grocery list on the kitchen table, reached the store, realized it, and run all the way back because she was afraid Evelyn would think she was irresponsible. Another entry read, "Heavy rain. Came anyway. Shoes soaked. Complained the entire time." Lena laughed out loud. "That sounds right," she murmured. The records did not flatter her. One note said, "Lena impatient today. Wanted to leave. Stayed for tea because I asked." Another, "Argued with mother. Slamming doors at home. Still brought milk." Lena frowned at that. She remembered being 14 and furious with Rachel over something she could no longer recall. Apparently, Evelyn had noticed. As she read, the sense of being evaluated began to shift. Evelyn had not written grades beside her behavior. There were no judgments like good girl or worthy or deserving. Most entries simply recorded what happened. Exam tomorrow. Came late. Studying at table while I put groceries away. 16 now. Taller. Still overpacks bags. Forgot Saturday. Returned Sunday morning apologizing. That one tightened something in Lena's chest. She remembered the panic when she realized she had missed the errand for the first time in years. Evelyn had barely reacted. "I survived," she had said, then handed Lena the list for the next week. Lena reached entries for more recent years. There were fewer observations, perhaps because the routine had become unremarkable. Working after school, tired, stayed 10 minutes longer because I was lonely. I did not tell her that. Lena stopped reading. The hidden room suddenly felt too quiet. She imagined Evelyn sitting downstairs after Lena left, writing that sentence in blue ink. Lena had always assumed the tea was for her. An old woman's way of filling time. She had never considered that sometimes Evelyn had needed the company badly enough to ask indirectly. A later entry said, "Rachel picked up extra shifts. Lena brought groceries before diner work." Another read, "College forms on kitchen table at home. She says money may decide." Lena's throat tightened. Evelyn had noticed more than Lena realized, but none of it looked like a secret examination. It looked like attention. There was a difference. Lena turned another page and found a longer entry dated less than a year before Evelyn's death. "She keeps coming when there is nothing here for her." Lena read the sentence once, then again. Her eyes blurred before she could stop them. She had spent days telling herself she had done nothing worth a house. Margaret's question had repeated in her head, "What did you do for my aunt that was worth a house?" Evelyn's notebook did not answer that. It did not assign value to the errands. It simply revealed that someone had seen them. 8 years Lena had considered ordinary enough to forget had mattered enough for Evelyn to record. She covered her mouth with one hand and cried quietly. Not from pride, but from the strange ache of being remembered in detail by someone who was no longer there to explain herself. After several minutes, Lena wiped her face and kept reading. The final entries were not about groceries at all. They referred to legal meetings, the condition of the house, and instructions Evelyn was preparing. One sentence made Lena sit straighter. "Do not make the house a prize." She must understand the record first. Below it, Evelyn had written a reference to another notebook, "Final instructions, blue ledger, top shelf." Lena looked up. On the highest shelf, behind 2 document boxes, a dark blue ledger rested flat against the wall. She stood, reached for it, and pulled it down with both hands. A label on the cover, written in Evelyn's careful script, contained only 3 words, "For Lena Mercer." Lena carried the blue ledger downstairs before opening it. The hidden room had begun to feel too crowded with Evelyn's voice. Even though every word was only ink on paper, she sat at the kitchen table where she had spent hundreds of Saturdays watching Evelyn unpack groceries. The dripping faucet sounded every few seconds. Outside, a car passed along Linden Street. Everything ordinary about the room made the ledger in front of her seem more personal. For Lena Mercer, Evelyn had written on the cover. Lena opened it. The first page contained no dramatic confession. Evelyn's handwriting was steady and practical. If you are reading this, then Thomas followed my instructions. You accepted the house, and you have looked through enough of the records to understand that the room is not filled with ordinary household papers. Lena almost heard Evelyn's dry tone. She continued, "First, the house is not payment for groceries." Lena stopped. Of all the questions she had asked since the estate meeting, Evelyn had chosen to answer that one first. 8 years of errands do not equal a house. Do not let anyone tell you they do, including yourself. Lena let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Margaret's question returned to her, but it hurt less now. Evelyn had understood exactly how unreasonable the inheritance would appear. Lena read on. Evelyn explained that she had begun keeping records because memory was unreliable. A paid heating bill could disappear into a drawer. A bus fare could be forgotten by the following week, yet sometimes the person who received help later helped someone else. And Evelyn had become interested in following those small continuations. She did not call them debts. She specifically warned Lena against doing so. Nobody in those cabinets owes me anything. The next pages explain the house. Evelyn had considered leaving it to relatives and separating the records from the property, but she feared the room would be treated as clutter during the clearing of the estate. Receipts without context looked worthless. Old utility notices looked disposable. Letters from strangers looked like paper belonging in a trash bag. "The house matters because the record remains safe here," she wrote. "That does not mean the house itself is sacred." Lena looked around the kitchen. The sagging cabinet door was still sagging. The faucet still dripped. Evelyn apparently had no intention of becoming more sentimental after death. Then came the part Lena feared. Why her? Evelyn wrote about David first. She described helping him when he was 22, his repeated attempts to repay her, and the satisfaction she felt when she later learned he had begun helping others instead, after David died. Evelyn noticed Lena because she was his daughter. That much Lena already knew. But Evelyn made something else clear. She had not arranged the first grocery errand. She had not sent Lena to the market as a test. She had not promised herself that David Mercer's daughter would become anything at all. "You picked up my bags before you knew I had known your father. You returned the next week before I asked you to make a habit of it?" Lena pressed her fingertips against the page. "I watched because I remembered him. I chose you later because you kept coming." There was no mention of perfection. Evelyn even referenced Lena's missed Saturday, her complaints, and the afternoons when she was plainly impatient. Kindness performed only by cheerful people would be rare indeed. Lena smiled through the ache in her throat. The ledger then returned to the inheritance. Evelyn had watched Lena continue the Saturday routine through school, work, arguments at home, bad weather, and changing plans. There had been no promised reward. Lena had not known about the hidden room. She had not known about David's history. She had not even known Evelyn was recording anything. That ignorance mattered to Evelyn. You were already inside the chain before you knew there was a chain. Lena closed her eyes. For days she had tried to make the equation work, groceries plus time plus companionship, somehow equaling real estate. Evelyn's explanation destroyed the equation completely. The house was not a prize. Lena had been chosen because Evelyn believed she would understand why the papers mattered before deciding what happened to them. A knock downstairs startled her. Margaret stood on the porch again. Lena almost did not let her in.
Then she remembered Evelyn's warning about treating the records as debts and realized she had begun treating the house like evidence she needed to defend. "I found something Evelyn wrote for me," Lena said after Margaret entered. Margaret's expression tightened. Another instruction? An explanation? They sat in the living room. Lena did not hand over the entire ledger, but she explained the part concerning the house. Evelyn had feared the records would be discarded if the property were emptied quickly. She had chosen Lena to inventory and understand them first. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Lena finished, Margaret looked toward Evelyn's chair. So she thought her own family would throw everything away? The hurt in her voice was immediate. I don't think she said it like that, but that's what it means. Maybe she thought nobody would know what the papers were. You didn't know either? No. Yet she trusted you to figure it out. Lena had no defense against that. I'm sorry. Margaret looked at her sharply. Why are you apologizing? Because I can see why this hurts. Margaret stood and walked toward the window. I kept meaning to visit more. Every time I waited too long, coming back became harder. She folded her arms. You know what happens when you haven't called someone in 3 months? You feel guilty. Then it becomes 6 months, and now the call is worse because you need an explanation. Eventually, every visit reminds you how long you were absent. Lena said nothing. I told myself Evelyn preferred being alone. Margaret continued. She was independent. She never begged anyone to visit. That made it easy. She could be difficult. Margaret gave a small laugh. That sounds like my aunt. Lena thought of the notebook entry. Stayed 10 minutes longer because I was lonely. I did not tell her that. She didn't always say what she needed. Margaret looked back at her. And somehow you knew? No. Sometimes I stayed by accident. The answer softened something between them. Margaret sat again. I'm still angry. You're allowed to be. I'm not sure I'm angry at you. That would make 2 of us, Margaret almost smiled. When she left, Lena returned to the kitchen and reopened the ledger. The remaining pages repeated one principle in different forms. Understand the record before deciding what to do with the property. Evelyn did not demand that Lena turn the house into a shrine. She did not command her to live there forever, but she wanted the decision made by someone who understood what would disappear if the records were treated as meaningless paper. Lena looked at the preliminary repair notes Noah had helped her assemble. Roof, plumbing, electrical inspection, insurance, taxes. Then she looked at the buyer's offer written in her notebook. For the first time, she understood why Evelyn had chosen her. The answer should have made everything easier. Instead, it clarified the problem Evelyn could not solve for her. Lena was still 19. She still worked diner shifts. She still had almost no savings. The roof would not repair itself because the papers beneath it mattered. The taxes would not disappear because Evelyn had trusted her. Understanding why she had inherited the house had changed the meaning of the inheritance, but it had not changed the cost of keeping it. Lena sat alone at Evelyn's kitchen table. The blue ledger opened beside a list of expenses she could not afford, and realized the mystery had finally given her an answer she had wanted from the beginning. Now she had to face a harder question. What if understanding why Evelyn gave her the house still wasn't enough to let her keep it? Lena spent the next morning at Evelyn's kitchen table with 3 columns written across a sheet of paper. Keep, sell, wait. By noon, wait was the only column containing anything. The roof estimate alone was enough to make her stomach tighten. Add insurance, taxes, an electrical inspection, plumbing repairs, and ordinary heating costs, and the house became something completely different from the miracle people imagined when they heard she had inherited it for $1. Rachel stopped by before her afternoon shift and found Lena staring at the numbers. "You're allowed to sell," she said.
I know. Evelyn said that herself. I know. Then why do you look like you're about to disappoint a dead woman? Lena put down her pencil. Because now I understand what's upstairs. Rachel sat across from her. Understanding it doesn't mean you have to preserve every wall around it. That sentence stayed with Lena after Rachel left. She returned to the hidden room and chose several files whose names she recognized well enough to locate the people or their families without exposing anyone's private history publicly. She wanted to know whether the papers meant what she thought they meant. The first person she spoke with was the adult daughter of Marjorie Keene, whose 1989 electric bill Lena and Rachel had found. Lena revealed only what was necessary. The woman remembered the winter immediately. Her father had been out of work and the electricity had been shut off during a bitter January week. My mother told us there was a billing mistake, she said. Years later, she admitted Evelyn paid enough to get it turned back on. Did your mother repay her? Lena asked. The woman smiled. She tried. Evelyn told her to keep it. Then she paused. Mom spent years taking meals to people from church when they were sick. I never connected those things. Lena did not tell her that Evelyn had. Another file led Lena to a retired woman who remembered Evelyn paying an examination fee when she was 17. Without it, she would have postponed a qualification she needed for work. It wasn't much money, the woman said. Not even then, but I didn't have it. She laughed softly. Evelyn could also be terribly judgmental. She once told me my first husband had the work ethic of a porch cat. Lena smiled. That sounds like her. Don't turn her into a saint because she died. I'm trying not to. Good. She would hate that too. That conversation mattered more than Lena expected. The files were not proof of a flawless woman dispensing wisdom across Maple Crossing. Evelyn had been stubborn, impatient, private, and sometimes difficult. Her help mattered precisely because it had come from an ordinary person with limited money and imperfect relationships. Lena returned to Arthur Bell that evening. He was sitting on his front steps when she approached. You're still working through those papers, he said. I'm trying to decide what to do with the house. Arthur shifted aside so she could sit. Lena told him about the repair costs, the offer, and her fear that selling would turn Evelyn's records into something she had failed to protect. Arthur listened without interrupting. I keep thinking there has to be a right answer. Lena said, keep the house and honor what she did, or sell it and admit I can't afford the responsibility. Those aren't the only two sentences available. They feel like it. Arthur looked across the street. When Evelyn bought me those work boots, I thought she had rescued me. You told me about them. What I didn't tell you was that the job lasted 4 months. Lena turned toward him. That's all? 4 months? Then I found something else. Life kept going. He rubbed his hands together. Evelyn never thought she was fixing somebody forever. Then what did she think she was doing? Arthur considered the question. Buying time, mostly. A week of groceries, a repaired shoe. Heat turned back on. Enough gas to reach work. He looked at Lena. Evelyn never thought she was saving people. She thought she was buying them enough time to save themselves. Lena thought of David's rent. 3 weeks. Not a new life, just 3 weeks in which his old life did not collapse. An interview, bus fare, a chance to start again. So what does that mean for the house? She asked. I'm not Evelyn. I can't answer that for you. Everybody keeps doing that. Arthur laughed. Good. Means we're learning. Back at the corner house, Lena walked slowly from room to room. She had unconsciously treated every physical part of the property as if it belonged to the record. The faded siding, Evelyn's chair, the old kitchen cabinets, the narrow hallway. Even the leaking faucet had begun to feel protected by memory. But Evelyn's own ledger had said the house was not sacred. What mattered was that the record survived and remained understandable. Lena climbed upstairs and entered the hidden room. She looked at the filing cabinets differently. Preserving them did not necessarily require preserving the building exactly as Evelyn had left it. Selling did not necessarily require throwing the records away. Keeping the house did not necessarily require turning it into a museum she could never afford. She could separate the question of Evelyn's legacy from the question of every old board and pipe surrounding it. That did not solve the money problem, but it changed its shape. Lena took out her notebook and started a new page. Instead of keep or sell, she wrote 2 questions. What must be preserved underneath what can change? The first answer came easily. The records, their context, and the connections Evelyn had spent decades documenting. The second list grew longer. Furniture could change, rooms could change, repairs could be practical instead of historically perfect. The property itself could potentially support some of its own costs. The records might eventually be protected somewhere safer than a room beneath an aging roof, provided privacy was respected. Lena did not yet know which option would work. She knew only that martyring herself financially was not the same thing as honoring Evelyn. Rachel had been right. Understanding the inheritance did not require preserving every wall around it. Lena carried her notebook downstairs and spread the repair estimates beside the buyer's offer. For the first time, she did not see 2 choices. She saw pieces that could perhaps be rearranged. The house had value. The records had value of a different kind. Her education mattered. Rachel's financial security mattered. Evelyn's history mattered. None automatically had to destroy the others. Lena turned to a clean page and began writing a plan. The plan Lena began the night before did not survive breakfast. By morning, it contained arrows, crossed-out numbers, question marks, and 3 different estimates for expenses she did not fully understand. She carried it to Evelyn's kitchen anyway, where Rachel joined her before work. Thomas Reed arrived 20 minutes later with a folder of estate papers, and Margaret came shortly after him. Lena had asked them all to meet because she had reached the point where making decisions alone felt less like independence and more like guessing. She spread the repair estimates across the table. "I know the records need to be preserved," she said. "I know Evelyn didn't require me to keep the house forever. What I don't know is exactly what she expected me to do after I understood them." Thomas opened his folder. "There are several final papers we have not reviewed in detail because Mrs. Ward instructed me to wait until you completed the inventory." Margaret glanced at Lena. "Did you? Enough to understand what the room is? That sounds like Evelyn's standard, not an inventory standard." Lena almost smiled. "Probably." Thomas removed several pages written in Evelyn's handwriting and placed them between them. "These accompany the ledger." Lena recognized the blue ink immediately. The first pages repeated much of what she had already learned. Evelyn described the records as evidence of assistance given, received, and sometimes passed forward. She warned against treating them as accounts receivable, moral debts, or proof that one person deserved praise more than another. Then David's name appeared. Lena slowed down. Evelyn described meeting him when he was 22 and struggling after losing work. She wrote about the rent payment, the interview, and his stubborn attempts to repay her. Rachel read silently beside Lena, one hand pressed against her mouth. Margaret watched without interrupting. David believed repayment meant returning what I had spent. Evelyn had written, "I believed repayment meant that the help should not end with him." Lena already knew what followed. Her father had eventually carried that principle into other people's lives. What she had not seen was Evelyn's description of the years after David died. "I watched his daughter because grief makes people search for what remains of someone they have lost. At first, that was all." Lena stopped reading. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Lena continued, Evelyn admitted that seeing David's daughter grow up had comforted her. She had expected nothing particular from Lena. Then came the day 11-year-old Lena saw her struggling with grocery bags. Evelyn described it almost exactly as Lena remembered it. One bag beginning to tear, a child taking the heavier load, and offered $2, refused. "I noticed because David would have noticed," Evelyn wrote. She returned because she was Lena. The sentence struck harder than Lena expected. It separated her from her father, while connecting them at the same time. Evelyn had not chosen Lena because she was a replacement for David. She had watched Lena become herself. The following pages describe the 8 years of Saturdays without romanticizing them. Lena forgot things, complained, arrived late, sometimes stayed for tea, and sometimes clearly wanted to leave. But she kept returning without knowing there was anything to gain. Then Lena reached a paragraph marked with a line in the margin. "David carried what I gave him. Lena carried what he never had time to explain." Rachel began crying quietly. Lena looked at her mother. "You okay?" Rachel nodded and wiped her cheek. "Keep reading." Evelyn explained that this was ultimately why she chose Lena. Not because blood relatives were unworthy, not because grocery errands were worth real estate, not because Lena had passed some hidden moral examination. Evelyn believed Lena had already participated in the principle behind the record without knowing the principle existed. That made her, in Evelyn's judgment, the person most likely to understand the difference between preserving a house and preserving what happened inside it. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Lena worried the explanation had hurt her again. "Margaret, I'm listening." Her voice was controlled. Thomas turned to the next page. "This section concerns the property itself." Lena straightened. Evelyn's instructions were even more direct there. "Lena may sell the house." Lena stared at the sentence. Thomas continued reading aloud. "She may sell it immediately after understanding the records, or later, or never. I leave that decision to her. If repairs are beyond her means, she is not to confuse financial suffering with loyalty." Rachel released a breath. Thank God. Even Margaret smiled faintly. Evelyn went further. Lena was not to abandon education, accumulate debt she could not manage, or preserve rooms merely because Evelyn had once lived in them. A house is wood, wire, pipe, glass, land, memory, and expense. Sentiment does not repair a roof. Noah would have liked that sentence. Lena looked at the ceiling stain. She really thought of everything. Thomas shook his head. "Not everything. She left decisions for you. That was precisely the problem. Permission to sell removed one burden, but created another. If Evelyn had ordered Lena to keep the house, Lena could blame Evelyn for whatever followed. If Evelyn had ordered her to sell it, Lena could obey. Instead, Evelyn had given her freedom. Margaret returned to the table. "Did she say anything about us?" Thomas checked the final pages. "Yes." Margaret stiffened. Evelyn acknowledged that relatives might feel excluded or insulted by the decision. She did not ask Lena to apologize for it, but neither did she ask her to shut the family out of Evelyn's history. Family photographs, letters, and personal materials unrelated to the record were to be handled respectfully. Margaret lowered her eyes. "That sounds like her." "There's more," Thomas said. The last page contained a short statement addressed to everyone who might someday interpret Evelyn's decision. She had not left Lena a mission. She had left her a choice after providing enough information to make it knowingly. If she keeps the house because it serves her life, good. If she sells because selling serves her life, good. If she preserves the record in a way I never imagined, better still. The point of helping someone is not to decide what they must become afterward. Lena leaned back. For weeks, she had been trying to discover the correct way to repay Evelyn. The papers told her that this was the wrong question. Rachel touched David's file. Your father had the same problem. What he kept trying to repay her because owing money was easier to understand than receiving freedom. Lena looked at her father's letters again. 22-year-old David had wanted a number. Evelyn had refused to give him one. Now Lena had inherited a house and wanted instructions precise enough to remove the risk of making the wrong choice. Evelyn had refused her that too. Margaret reached for one of the family photographs Thomas had brought from another box. I can help identify some of these, she said quietly. Lena looked at her. You would? She was still my aunt. There was sadness in the words, but less anger. And apparently I have some catching up to do. Rachel offered to help sort David's history from private information that should remain private. Thomas said he could advise them on the estate documents and point Lena toward appropriate professional guidance concerning the records, though the ultimate decisions remained hers. For the first time, the kitchen table did not feel like a place where Lena had been left alone with an impossible inheritance. When the others departed, she stayed behind. The buyer's offer remained in her notebook. So did the roof estimate. Nothing had magically become affordable. But Evelyn's final papers had removed the false choice Lena had been carrying. Selling was not betrayal. Keeping the house was not repayment. Ruining herself would honor nothing. Lena walked slowly through the downstairs rooms, then stood at the foot of the staircase. She thought about the hidden room above her, the thousands of small decisions recorded there, and the $1 bill she had placed on Thomas Reed's table. Evelyn had not purchased Lena's future with a house. She had deliberately refused to purchase it. Lena returned to the kitchen and placed a fresh sheet of paper beside her notebook. At the top, she wrote 3 questions. What should be kept? What can be changed? What can the house realistically support? Then she looked around Evelyn's old kitchen, no longer asking what the dead woman expected her to do. The decision was finally hers, and Lena understood that deciding what to keep would be harder than discovering why she had inherited it. Lena's first decision was not to make Evelyn's house into a memorial. The thought had crossed her mind because it seemed respectful. But the more she considered it, the less sense it made. Evelyn had not preserved decades of records so that strangers could walk past her furniture and admire a dead woman's kitchen. The records mattered because of the people inside them, not because the wallpaper remained unchanged. Lena also rejected the opposite extreme. She could not bring herself to empty the house quickly, send the filing cabinets to storage, and sell everything before she understood how to protect what Evelyn had left. Instead, she began with a list of practical steps. Thomas Reed helped her identify which documents belonged to the estate and which were personal records that required more careful handling. He also warned her that many files contained private financial and medical details. Preserving history doesn't mean making everyone's worst year public, he told her. Lena wrote that sentence at the top of her notebook. She contacted a small local historical organization that maintained community archives for Maple Crossing and nearby neighborhoods. They could not simply take the collection and display it, but they explained how the materials could be cataloged, digitized, and restricted when necessary. Some files could eventually be made available with names or sensitive details protected. Others might remain closed for years. For the first time, Lena understood that preserving Evelyn's work required more than keeping paper dry. It required judgment. Margaret surprised her by becoming useful almost immediately. She arrived one afternoon carrying 2 boxes of family photographs, old Christmas cards, and letters Evelyn had sent over the years. These were at my house, she said. I thought they might help. Lena opened one box and found pictures of Evelyn, decades younger, standing beside people Lena could not identify. You know who these are? Some of them. Margaret sat beside her on the living room floor. Not enough. There was regret in her voice, but she no longer tried to turn it into anger. Together they sorted the photographs,
Margaret identified relatives, old neighbors, and several people whose surnames appeared in the hidden files. Sometimes a photograph supplied missing context. A woman Lena knew only from a utility receipt suddenly had a face. A man connected to a bus ticket appeared in a neighborhood picnic photograph 20 years later. I thought Aunt Evelyn was mostly alone after my uncle died. Margaret said, maybe she was lonely.
That isn't the same as being disconnected. Lena looked toward the staircase. I think I confused those things too. Margaret nodded. I probably needed to. Rachel helped with David's material. For years. Lena's father had existed in family stories that stopped whenever the memories became painful. Now Rachel began filling in small gaps. Not grand revelations, ordinary details. David had once worked 2 jobs for 3 months because he hated being behind on bills. He repaired things badly but confidently. He kept extra canned food in the house after the winter when he had struggled. He sometimes gave people more help than Rachel thought they could afford. Did that make you angry? Lena asked. Sometimes. Rachel smiled. Kindness is easier to admire when you're not the one balancing the checkbook. That answer stayed with Lena because it kept Evelyn's principle from becoming sentimental. Helping mattered, but so did limits. Lena could preserve the record without destroying herself financially. Noah helped her approach the house the same way. He returned with his uncle's recommendations and divided the problems into urgent, necessary, and cosmetic. Roof first, he said, tapping the page. Not because it's romantic, because water ruins everything underneath it, including several decades of paper. Exactly. The electrical work needed professional attention. The dripping faucet was minor. The shifting porch step could be repaired without rebuilding the whole porch. Several rooms looked worn, but were structurally fine. You don't have to renovate the place into something from a magazine. Noah said, Good. I can't afford the magazine. You can probably afford a library card. Lena threw a pencil at him. The work was still expensive. But the numbers became less terrifying once they were divided into what actually had to happen and what could wait. Lena also began exploring how the house might support part of its own cost. The property had more space than she needed. She did not settle on a final arrangement immediately, but she stopped thinking of ownership as simply paying for an empty building. There were practical possibilities, provided she approached them carefully and legally, most importantly. She stopped assuming that preserving Evelyn's legacy required Lena to become Evelyn. She did not need to spend the next 50 years paying strangers' bills, recording every favor, or living in the corner house forever. Evelyn had done those things because they fit her life. Lena needed to decide what fit hers. One afternoon, while she and Margaret were labeling photograph sleeves at the dining room table, Margaret held up a picture of Evelyn standing outside the house with a much younger Arthur Bell. Do you think she knew what all this would become? Margaret asked. Lena looked around at the boxes. I don't think she thought of it as becoming anything. Hundreds of files seem like something. Maybe. But each one started as somebody needing help with one problem. Margaret considered that. And somehow you inherited all of it? Not all of it. You inherited the house. That's different. A week later, Thomas stopped by while Lena was speaking with a representative from the local archive. The representative asked why Evelyn had left the property to Lena rather than a relative or institution. Before Lena could answer, Margaret, who was standing nearby, said, because she trusted Lena to understand the records. The absence of bitterness in her voice caught Lena's attention. Thomas smiled faintly and returned to his papers. Later that afternoon, Noah arrived to measure the porch step. Arthur Bell stopped by, carrying an envelope with an old photograph he thought belonged with the collection. Rachel brought sandwiches from home because Lena had forgotten to eat. For a brief moment, the living room felt crowded in the best possible way. Not like a shrine, like a house being used. Arthur looked around and chuckled. Evelyn would complain about all these shoes by the door. She would, Margaret said. Then she'd make tea for everybody. Lena smiled. The property buyer's offer remained tucked inside her notebook, but it no longer felt like a deadline. She had not promised herself she would never sell. She had simply decided she would not sell out of panic. The archive organization agreed to help create a preservation plan for the records, including digitization and privacy restrictions. Margaret offered to help identify family material. Rachel would continue filling in David's history. Noah and his uncle could help Lena understand what repairs were truly necessary. None of that solved every problem, but the inheritance no longer felt like a sealed box with only two choices. It had become something she could shape. Near the end of the day, Arthur picked up one of Evelyn's old grocery lists from the kitchen counter. "Still strange to think all this started with you carrying bags," he said. Lena shook her head. "It didn't." Arthur looked at her. Lena glanced toward the hidden room upstairs, then at David's file resting safely inside a protective folder. "Everyone keeps saying Evelyn gave me the house because I brought her groceries." She folded the old list carefully. "She didn't." By early spring, the corner house at Linden and Ash no longer looked abandoned by grief. It did not look transformed either. Lena had resisted every suggestion that involved making the place prettier before making it safe. The roof section above the living room had been repaired first. The electrical system had been inspected and updated where necessary. The kitchen faucet finally stopped dripping. Noah and his uncle repaired the shifting porch step without replacing the whole porch, and several drafty windows were sealed rather than discarded. The faded cream siding remained faded. Evelyn's kitchen cabinets still sagged slightly in places. The old maple still shaded the sidewalk. Lena liked that the house looked cared for without pretending time had never touched it. The repairs cost more than she wanted and less than she had once feared. She kept careful records of every expense, partly because she was learning to think like an owner, and partly because Rachel had made her promise never to treat inheritance money, property value, or future income as imaginary money. Lena still worked diner shifts. She had also completed the paperwork to begin community college classes and bookkeeping, instead of postponing school indefinitely. She would not attend full-time at first, but she would attend. That decision mattered more than she expected. For several weeks after inheriting the house, Lena had quietly assumed that accepting Evelyn's gift required sacrificing whatever plans she had before it. Evelyn's final instructions had forced her to see that sacrifice was not the same thing as gratitude. The house was now arranged to support part of its own cost in a practical way. Lena used only the space she needed and prepared another part of the property for lawful rental once all required inspections and arrangements were complete. It would not make her wealthy. It would help cover expenses. More importantly, it meant the property could exist inside Lena's life rather than consume it. The hidden room changed more carefully. Nothing was thrown away merely because it looked old. Nothing was displayed merely because it looked interesting. With guidance from the local historical organization, Lena, Margaret, Rachel, and several volunteers began cataloging the collection. Sensitive medical information, financial hardship, and private correspondence were marked for restricted access. Documents suitable for preservation were scanned. Names were indexed. Dates were cross-referenced. Context was added where reliable witnesses or family records could support it. Margaret proved especially patient with photographs. She identified distant relatives, old friends, former neighbors, and places Lena had never known. Sometimes she sat for 10 minutes holding a picture before remembering a surname. Sometimes she admitted she had no idea who someone was. Aunt Evelyn would probably be irritated that I forgot. Margaret said one afternoon. She'd probably write it down. Lena replied. Margaret laughed. Their relationship had become easier without becoming falsely intimate. Margaret was still Evelyn's niece.
Lena was still the 19-year-old neighbor who inherited the house. Neither fact needed to be erased for them to work together. Rachel's contribution was different. She began recording memories of David in short written notes so they would not remain dependent on her ability to remember details years later. Lena read each one slowly. David burning pancakes and insisting they tasted better that way. David keeping extra canned food after the winter when money had nearly run out. David fixing a coworker's fence badly enough that they had to redo part of it together. David leaving groceries at someone's door and pretending he happened to have bought too much. These memories changed the file Evelyn had kept on him. He was no longer simply a young man saved by 3 weeks of rent and an interview. He was a person who had carried forward something he had once received. That difference was the entire point. The record itself became clearer as the months passed. Evelyn had not helped everyone in Maple Crossing. She could not have. She had not changed every life she touched. Some files ended after one payment with no later continuation. Some people moved away. Some never repaid money or passed help forward in a way Evelyn knew about. A few thanked her and disappeared from the record entirely. Lena found that strangely comforting. The collection was not a moral scoreboard pretending everyone became better after receiving kindness. It was evidence of possibilities. A heating bill paid, a pair of work boots purchased, a bus fare covered, a school fee handled, a rent shortage bridged, a recommendation written. Sometimes that was all. Sometimes the person helped later became the person helping. Evelyn had recorded both outcomes without forcing meaning where none existed. The local archive eventually prepared a small interpretive display about the collection, but Lena insisted it not be called the Evelyn Ward Charity Records. Evelyn would have hated that, and Lena understood why. The display instead focused on the movement of small acts through Maple Crossing across decades. Where privacy allowed, it showed anonymous or permission-based examples, an electric bill paid during winter, followed years later by meals delivered to sick neighbors, work boots bought for a young man, followed by repairs he later performed for someone else, bus fare to an interview, followed by another person helping someone reach work. At the center was not Evelyn's portrait, but a simple line taken from one of her notes. When you can carry something for somebody else, carry it. Arthur Bell stood in front of that sentence for a long time the first day the display was ready. She'd say this was too much fuss, he said. Definitely. Lena replied. Then she'd correct the labels. Definitely. Arthur smiled, then pointed toward one of the anonymous examples. That one's mine. Lena knew. She had helped preserve it without placing his name publicly beside it. You okay with how it's written? Yeah. He looked at her. You figured out what to keep? Lena glanced around the room. Still figuring it out. Margaret brought one final box of family materials that afternoon. Rachel brought David's written history. Noah arrived late with dust on his sleeves from work and stood awkwardly beside the display until Lena teased him for looking nervous in a room full of paper. The gathering was small. That felt appropriate. No reporters, no dramatic ceremony, no crowd pretending Evelyn had secretly been the most important person in town. Only people who understood that significance did not always announce itself. Later, when everyone had gone, Lena returned to the hidden room alone. Most of the original files remained there temporarily in protective storage while preservation work continued. The room smelled less dusty now. Boxes were labeled more clearly. The old filing cabinets stood in the same places. Lena opened David's file. She no longer needed to read every page to remember what was inside. At 22, her father had lost his job and fallen behind on rent.
Evelyn had paid enough to keep the situation from collapsing. She had helped him reach an interview. He had tried to repay her repeatedly. She had refused. When you can carry something for somebody else, carry it. David had done that. Not perfectly, not constantly, and not because Evelyn had demanded lifelong service from him. He had simply noticed other people more often after someone noticed him. Then he died when Lena was 9, leaving her too young to understand any of it. 2 years later, 11-year-old Lena saw an elderly neighbor struggling with grocery bags and picked up the heavier one. No one told her the story first. No one promised her anything. No one explained that her father had once stood on the receiving end of the same principle. She had simply carried what was in front of her. That was what Evelyn had recognized. Lena touched the edge of the page where Evelyn had written, "David carried what I gave him." Lena carried what he never had time to explain. For months, Lena had wondered whether the house was wildly disproportionate payment for 8 years of groceries. Now the question seemed almost absurd. Evelyn had never calculated grocery trips against property value. The dollar Lena placed on Thomas Reed's table had not purchased a reward. The house had been a container, a responsibility, an opportunity, and eventually a choice. The actual inheritance was understanding what the hidden record meant. Lena closed David's file and returned it to its place. Saturday morning arrived bright and cool. Lena had an early diner shift later, and a community college orientation packet waited on her desk. She locked the corner house and started down Linden Street carrying a small grocery bag. Halfway along the block, she stopped at the home of an older woman Rachel knew from the nursing home neighborhood network. The woman had recently injured her wrist and had trouble carrying heavier groceries. Lena had offered to pick up a few things while she was already at the market. Nothing about the errand felt ceremonial. No notebook waited for Lena to record it. No house stood at the end of it. No one promised that kindness would return multiplied. The woman opened the door and said, "You didn't have to do that." Lena handed her the bag. "I know." She stayed long enough to place the milk in the refrigerator because the woman could not lift it comfortably with one hand. Then Lena stepped back outside. The morning traffic moved through Maple Crossing. Somewhere behind her, inside the corner house, decades of receipts, letters, names, and ordinary emergencies were being preserved because Evelyn Ward had believed small things were worth remembering. Lena understood now that Evelyn had never asked anyone to become extraordinary. She had only noticed moments when one person could make another person's burden slightly easier to carry. Sometimes that meant 3 weeks of rent, sometimes work boots, sometimes heat restored on a Thursday. Sometimes a grocery bag carried 3 blocks by an 11-year-old girl who had no idea she was continuing a story begun before she was born. Lena adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward home. She was still 19. She still worried about tuition, work schedules, repairs, and money. Owning a house had not solved her life. Understanding Evelyn had not made adulthood easier, but it had changed what Lena believed counted as help. She no longer thought kindness belonged mainly to people with extra money, extra time, or some special ability to rescue others. Most of Evelyn's record had been built from people doing one manageable thing when another person needed it. Evelyn had carried what she could until she could not carry it anymore. Then, for one symbolic dollar, she had placed the house, the record, and the choice into Lena's hands. Lena had spent months believing she needed to repay that gift somehow. Now she knew better. Repayment had never been the point. The point was simply this: when something became too heavy for someone else, and Lena had room in her hands, she could carry part of it for a while.